The name of this sermon is called Rules to Obey. Last week, I used the quote, "For such a time as this," from Esther, when she broke the rules at the risk of her life to save her people, the Jews. Mordecai told her to do it, and she rightly and sensibly said, breaking that law comes with the death penalty. And the only exception is when the king is feeling generous and gives you a pardon. And my assumption is that there had been enough people who had received the opposite, that everyone knew that this law had teeth. People had been off with your head. Well, Esther did it. She broke the law and she saved her people. Many years ago, before the United States was the United States, there was something called the Boston Tea Party. Now you remember that is where they went on the ships and threw the tea into the Boston Harbor. And it was not because they wanted to revolt. It was because England had done something that was unlawful. England had made a deal with the people of America that they didn't collect taxes from them. The people from America set up their own governments, they collected the tax, some went to England, but England in its wisdom, in its parliament, said we're going to collect taxes. And you know that whenever you have an agreement, we had the NAFTA agreement between the United States, Mexico, and Canada, and they decided to come up with a new one. And they canceled NAFTA, but we all got together and we negotiated it. When the British Parliament put this in place, they didn't do that. And the people of America rightly said, we're not going to do this. We have a right to break an illegal law. In the U.S., they put together limited government, it was called. So the government of the states had a certain power, the legislature had a certain power, and when President Biden said we're going to put vaccine mandates in place, the states said, you can't do that. That's not in your wheelhouse. You're not allowed to do that. And they took it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, yes, you're right. That's the state's decision to make and not yours. It's unconstitutional. In 2015, the Canadian government, a newly elected Liberal government, decided to put a law in that said it's illegal not to use a person's preferred pronoun. Now, my preferred pronoun is he. Wanda's is she. Probably you're the same way. But a personal pronoun could be they, or them, or him, or his, or zib. There's 700 of them and more. And the problem is, if you said he or she, you could be charged under this law and fined or sent to prison. Well, there was a professor who said, no, I'm not going to do that. You can send me to jail, but I'm not going to do this. No country, no democratic country has ever done this before. It's called compelled speech. No one has ever done that. You can't tell me what to say. Now he said, I don't mind if somebody comes to me and says, call me Ziz. I'm fine with that, but for the government to do it, I will refuse. And he had such a compelling argument, and he said it so forcefully and so eloquently that the government backed down. And then for the next 2 years, he traveled all over the world and was interviewed by every media in the world, and they said, Canada did this? Are you serious? Is that what happened? Black eye was given to Canada and to the Liberal government. He even was asked to run for Prime Minister, and he probably would have won. All of that, the book book he wrote and the millions of dollars he earned from the book, all from saying, no, I refuse to obey an illegal law or a bad law. I was reading a book, I told you a number of years ago, a number of weeks ago, a book, and I've reversed that. Just a minute, let me go back. John MacArthur has a church in California, and California put in that you couldn't come to the church services, and he obeyed, and he had it recorded, which was what they did anyway, but some people never heard, and they showed up at the church. 8,000 seat auditorium with 300 people in it. And it was, and he never sent them away. He never said, you guys get over here, you're not allowed. And word got around, and the next week it was double that. And it was double and double until in a couple months the place was full. And the media called him up and said, how come you haven't sent these people away? And he said, they know the risk and they have come. I have given them the option of watching it at home. And if you send me to prison, I'll start a prison ministry. And Gavin Newsom, the governor, was wise enough to know that John MacArthur was more popular than he was and didn't say anything. Well, let me go back to the book I was going to tell you about, The Pastor's Wife. Pastor's Wife is a book about how the Romanian government was taken over by the communists, and they made a whole lot of things. Christianity and the Bible and all that were illegal. And her husband continued to preach. And eventually he was arrested and put in prison, and they came to her and said, you, because you're married to this man, have no rights. You cannot buy food, you cannot work and earn money. But if you divorce him, we'll give you all those things back. And they were going to use it to say to him, see, what are you doing? Just give up. Your wife even divorced you. They came to her repeatedly and she refused. And then they came back to her and said, he died in prison, you should remarry. Same idea, they were going to get her to remarry, and then they come to him and say, see, your wife has left you and remarried. He refused, she refused to do this to him. A number of years later, she too was put in prison for a couple of years, but he spent 15 years in prison, and when Stalin died and Khrushchev was put in place, they eased things, and he was allowed out of prison. And the communist government wanted him to be treated horribly because of the wicked criminal he was, but that wasn't what people did. They treated him like a national hero because everyone wanted to do this, but they didn't have the spirit or they knew what would happen, but they honored him. And so they asked him to speak all over. And he did. He went all over the country speaking. And these people came to hear him speak, even though what he was doing was illegal, and them coming to hear it was illegal. And after a year, they put him back in prison because he was stirring up too much problems for them. Well, as you read through the Gospels, you find that Jesus carefully followed some rules, and others he just completely ignored. The nation of Israel was a theocracy, which means that the laws they had were put in place by God. The problem was that the religious leaders had put a lot of their own laws in place and just called them God's laws. Well, Jesus did break their laws because they weren't legal laws, or you couldn't continue to be called a theocracy if you had made up your own laws. The laws Jesus broke, he broke because they had no business making them up. One of the laws was honor the Sabbath day and keep it holy, and do no work on the Sabbath. And so Jesus honored that law. But they, in Matthew, let me read this. Matthew 12, 1 and 2. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples became hungry and began to pick the heads of grain and eat. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, Lord, your disciples do what is not lawful to do on a Sabbath. Now, you can imagine what's happening, right? They're walking through the grain, and the grain is standing, and they go like this, and they grab a handful, and they rub it in their hands, and they blow the chaff away, and they eat those kernels. Now, they said that's work, that's harvesting. You can't harvest on Sunday. But it's no different than I'm walking through the field, and I pull up a piece of grass that's, the head, and you put it in your mouth. You've seen that picture, and you chew off the little bit about this long. Same thing. But, see, Jesus made up these rules. He made up the rule about the Sabbath day, and he knew if it was breaking or not breaking it. Who better to know? And Jesus was not having any of it. So let's look at the laws that Mary and Joseph kept when Jesus was born and decide if it was good of them to keep them. Number 1 is a rule and a command. Verse 21 says, and when 8 days had passed before his circumcision, his name was then called Jesus, the name being given by an angel before he was conceived in the womb. Other translations say he was circumcised on the 8th day. Now, the reason he was circumcised on the 8th day is God made a rule that all Jewish men would have to be circumcised. And so if your family had a young boy born, on the 8th day after he was born, he was to be circumcised. Now, medical professionals have discovered that a circumcision, of course, which is painful, is less painful and heals better if it's done on the 8th day, which is kind of a gift, both to the child and to the parents, because there's less crying and for not as long, shorter time. It is done to adults too, but it's way easier and better to do it when God said it was the best time to do it. It was an outward symbol of a change of your heart. It wasn't as if an 8-year-old child, an 8-year-old boy, could decide that he was going to follow Jesus, going to follow God. It's the fact that your parents agreed to bring him up in the fear and admonition of the Lord. It was you committing for them until they were old enough to commit for themselves. We're going to do this for you because we believe that you should be a follower of God. It comes under the heading of train up your child in the way he should go, and when he is old he will not depart from it. So this is what Joseph and Mary were doing, committing to obey the rules that God had put in place for this future man of God. The second part of the command was given by the angel in regard to his name. Name this son Jesus before he was conceived in the womb. People would see this as strange. If you remember the story of Zacharias, he was going to name his son John, and the people said, why are you naming him John? You have no one in your family by that name. The same would be true for Jesus. Why are you not naming him Joseph? Why are you naming him Jesus? And everybody around would find it strange, and it would just add to the rumor mill. You see, it was the father of the child who was naming him, and that wasn't Joseph. Number 2, a rule for Mary and one for Jesus. Verse 22 says, and when the days of their purification according to the law of Moses was complete, they brought him up to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord. as is written in the law of the Lord, every firstborn male who opens the womb shall be called holy to the Lord. And to offer a sacrifice according to what was said in the law of the Lord, a pair of turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. Now, in the law, anytime a woman had an issue of blood, that would be her period, or had a child, she was unclean for 7 days, and when she had a child, it was 33 days more for a male child, and double that for a female child. So it was 40 days for a male, and once that 40 days were up, she would come and offer a sacrifice, or a lamb, or 2 doves or pigeons. In Leviticus 12, 6-8, it says, 12, 6-8. Says, when the days of her purification are completed, for a son or for a daughter, she shall bring to the priest at the doorway of the tent of meeting a 1-year-old lamb for a burnt offering, and a young pigeon or turtle dove for a sin offering. Then he shall offer it before the Lord and make atonement for her, and she shall be cleansed from the flow of her blood. This is the law for her who bears a child, whether male or female. But if she cannot afford a lamb, then she shall take 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, one for the burnt offering, the other for the sin offering. The priest shall make atonement for her, and she will be clean. Now, as you read these verses in Luke, you come to understand that these, in verse 24, to offer a sacrifice according to the law, you realize that they must have been hard up. And it makes sense, because they had traveled to Bethlehem. Of course, he had no job in Bethlehem, and he had no family there. So who would look after Mary but him? If she needed looked after, it would have to fall to him, and that would mean he couldn't find work. And so they would find it very tough. And there's another thing going on. When God had brought the Israelites up from Egypt, there had been all those plagues, and the last plague had been where all the firstborn of Egypt had died. And he kept safe all the firstborn of Israel. And in a way, he purchased them. He said, these belong to me. If you remember, it says, firstborn male that opens the womb shall be called holy to the Lord. And so what had happened is, God said, these are mine. Every firstborn is mine. And they belong to him, and they had to be redeemed. If you look at Numbers 18:16, it says, and to their redemption price, from a month old you shall redeem them, for the valuation 5 shekels is silver, according to the shekel of the sanctuary. Now, you're wondering to yourself, well, why did they need to redeem them? Well, it goes back to the story of Moses. And Moses had gone up to the top of Mount Sinai, and he'd spent 40 days up there. And the people had come to Aaron and said, we don't know what's happened to this Moses. Make us gods for us to worship. And so they made these golden calves. And so when Moses came down, he smashed the stone tablets that God had made, and he called for anyone who was for the Lord to come to me. And the only ones that came to him were the Levites. Everybody else stayed in their partying mode. And he said, strap on your sword and kill people indiscriminately. Your brothers, your neighbors, your friends, and 3,000 people were killed. And when God said, the firstborn male that opens the womb belongs to me shall be called holy, what happened was he substituted the Levites. These people lost the chance because they would have been, the firstborns would have been the ones that became priests and people that looked after the temple, but then it was the Levites. And so the other people had to redeem themselves, and it was 5 shekels of silver. Now, this is why Jesus, who was from the tribe of Judah, had to be redeemed. He was the one that would serve the Father more than anyone else, and he never sinned, but he followed the law. He so identified with the people that he took on their guilt in this matter too. Number 3, a wonderful bonus. Verse 25. And there was a man in Jerusalem whose name was Simeon. This man was righteous and devout, looking for the consolation of Israel. And the Holy Spirit was upon him. And it had been revealed to him by the Holy Spirit that he would not see death before he had seen the Lord's Christ. And he came in the Spirit into the temple. And when the parents brought in the child Jesus to carry out for him the custom of the law, he took him in his arms and blessed God and said, Now, Lord, you are releasing your bondservant to depart in peace, according to your word. For my eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared in the presence of all people, a light of revelation to the Gentiles and the glory of your people Israel. Well, verse 27 is the record of Jesus being brought into the temple to perform the custom of the law. He was going to be redeemed, and this obedience came with a bonus. The bonus was that Simeon was able to come and meet them there. Verse 26 tells us that God had promised that he would see the Lord's Christ before he died. And I wonder how long he waited. My guess is it had been a while, quite a while. Because verse 29 says, Now you are letting your bondservant depart in peace according to your word. Now, as I thought about that, I said to myself, if this was a long time, and it could well be a long time, because if you remember, Abraham had been promised to have all these children, as many as the stars in the sky, and he had waited 25 years for this to happen. And if Simeon had waited long, he would wonder how this is going to happen. Yes, I believe that God is going to show me his anointed one, the Messiah. I'm going to get to see him. But am I going to be in the back row, and he's going to be up on the stage, and I'm a quarter of a mile away, and I can see a little dot that's a baby? What's it going to look like? How is it going to happen? Who would ever imagine when God said to him, I'm going to let you see my anointed, that he would be able to come in and hold the child in his arms? Can you believe this? Here was this old man, not even a priest as far as we know, approaching the family entrusted with the Messiah, and they'd only had this 40 days, and he's saying, hand me your baby. I got stuff I want to do. You can imagine what this would be like. Think of this as you're a person who loves stuff about the royals, and you heard that Andrew had a baby, and he's the prince, and you say, I'm going to England. And so you leave Canada, jump on a plane, go to England, and you walk up to one of those guys with the big fur hats on, the big tall fur hats, and say, look, I need you to open the gate because I'm going in, and I want you to let them know that I'm going to hold Prince Andrew's son, and I'm going to get selfies taken with it, and it's going to be a great time for me. And you know what he would do? Nothing. He would just ignore you completely, because that's what would happen. That's not going to happen. But here was this random stranger asking to hold their baby. More rightly, God's Messiah. And they hand him over in order to share this blessing with him. And you think to yourself, I'm a new mother, and I'm handing my child off to some stranger, some old guy. Well, you know, the thing is that they obeyed, and because they obeyed this law about redeeming their son, they were in the right place at the right time so that Simeon could have this blessing that he waited years to have. And not only could he have the blessing, he could have a blessing far beyond what he ever thought was possible. My daughter told me this story. She has 4 little girls, cutest little girls, totally unbiased opinion. But she was in McDonald's with the 4 girls, and they were behaving themselves really well. And people love watching children who are well behaved in a humble situation like a restaurant. And so a woman came over to her, an older woman, and said, "Look, I really enjoyed watching your children, and I want to congratulate you that they are so well behaved." You see, their behavior had brought joy to this woman, and she was happy to watch. So happy, in fact, that she took it upon herself to come and say, "Look, you brought a little joy into my life." How much more a gift will it be if we obey the Lord and somebody sees it and says, "You obeyed the Lord," and it's brought tears to my eyes, and I was having a horrible day, and you made it better. I had a woman call me up and said, "Look, we need you to fill out a survey of what you watch listen to on the radio for 2 weeks." And I joked with her, and I was smiling. You could tell I was smiling as I was joking with her. And she said, "Thank you. This has been a hard day for me, and you joking with me has made it better." Simple thing. Simple thing. I just didn't say, "Oh, get the," and slam the phone down in her ear. It made a difference for her. So what's the conclusion? Well, there was a blessing that came from Mary and Joseph obeying the law. Simeon, then Anna, and us are blessed by that. We're reading this story, and we're saying they handed over God, the Messiah, to a stranger, and he got such a blessing. And we get such a blessing reading it. It's wonderful. Well, we as Canada have been considered a Christian country. And we were, and some of the remnants of it are still left, but every year less of it. It's in smaller supply. We want to think no one will stop us from worshiping God in the way we see fit. No one will come and say, "You can't do that. I want to take away your freedoms that are given to us in the Canadian Constitution." But more and more it's not true. Just before Christmas, the Canadian House of Parliament passed a law called C4. C4 has a lot of stuff in it, but there was one thing in it that was voted on 6 months ago, and 60 members of Parliament voted against it, and this time it was unanimously passed. Everyone passed it. Then they walked across the stage to the floor, and they shook each other's hand and hugged each other. And it went to the Senate, and it passed just like that. No debate. Now, C4, you wonder, why does that sound familiar? C4 is plastic explosives. And this is explosive. And the part I looked at, talking about, is called conversion therapy. And it's the practice of saying to someone who is a homosexual or who is transgender, "Let me help you with that. If you want to change back, you have changed. If you want to change back, I could help you with it." And I watched clips from CTV and other places, and they made it sound like it's horrible. This man is telling his story, and you go, "Oh, And it's almost like torture, and we'd all agree that that's not the right way. That doesn't sound good at all. But if a homosexual came to a pastor and said, look, I've been a homosexual for years, and it has steadily got worse. I need someone to help me. Can you tell me how God can help me escape from this lifestyle, or I'm going to commit suicide? I'm going to end my life. I've got to have some help. So if you're a Christian or a pastor, and you say, well, this is what God says about it, and you are right, it's breaking God's law, you could be charged under the law. I read the summary of the law on the Government of Canada website. It says it guards religious freedom, but it also says that if you say that a heterosexual or a man or male or female is in any way better than being homosexual or transgendered, you can be charged under the law, fined or sent to jail. Now, if you say God created male and female, and sex was in his creation, his gift to people, but only in a very narrow framework of a man and a wife, you're skating on very thin ice. And that cracking you hear was the ice cracking under your feet, and you may well be no longer safe. And if a pastor, and I know this is going to happen, a pastor is going to be arrested for this. And it may well be that he's set up. Some homosexual comes to him and says, help me. Well, it's being recorded in his pocket, and then he's charged. And then the government comes to the church and says, you need to divorce yourself from this guy, or we're going to take away your charitable status, and we're going to charge you tax on your building and everything that comes in, and we're going to take away your right to give out charitable receipts. Now, with this in place, the only safe and legal thing a pastor or a Christian could say to this person is, by law, I cannot give you any negative opinion on this problem you have because you don't have a problem. The only thing I can say is you could avail yourself of assisted death or call a suicide helpline. Now, I predict that this 2022 may be a year where we say, well, is this the year that the government is going to have overreach into our life? And by us obeying God's law, we break humans' law. Now, let me tell you a few ways that we can obey God's law. Now, a lot of the things in the Bible are no longer for us. We no longer give sacrifices of animals. We can eat lobster if you want to. Just saying, it's safe to eat. Go to the Elma and eat lobster. Those things are okay. Love your neighbor as yourself is still one that we need to obey. And C4, because of the way it's written, may say to you, no, you can't love the neighbor as yourself because you cannot help him. You're not allowed. They have a problem, but you can't even call it a problem. The second is obey God when he specifically directs you. In the case where the angel came to Joseph and said, name him Jesus. Well, the problem with this is sometimes it occurs that the devil would want you to think, trick you into believing that it comes from God. the way to be sure that you know that it's not is if it breaks the law that God has put in place, then you know it's not right, because God is not a God of confusion. If you know that you've had a dream and it says you need to steal your neighbor's lawnmower, well, that's not from God. Well, the third way is harder, to be sure. Sometimes obeying God's law is breaking man's law. The pastor in the book, the pastor's wife, he broke God's law. Sometimes it's clearly government overreach, and in the case of communist countries, they ban the Bible and ban worship of God. I don't know, you probably read them as I've read them, God's Smuggler, about men and women who would take Bibles to China and to other communist countries in Russia. And God would be in it so that, as I read the stories, the suitcase was opened. And there's 48 Bibles. And the guy's just sweating bullets because he moves the clothes and there's 48 Bibles, and he picks them up and he puts them down, and he can't even see that they're Bibles. God has blinded him. He closes the suitcase and says, off you go. And there's no understanding other than that it's a miracle from God. Now, I can't tell you the time when it will come where the government has stepped over the line and said, you have to obey government's laws, and we're taking away your religious freedom. Maybe it's already on us in 2022. And this year will be the year that will become clear that these things are really there. The only thing I can say is we need to pray for our leaders, pray that they'll make wise decisions, and the other prayer is for God to give us courage to disobey laws that are clearly breaking His laws for us. And it won't be easy, and it won't be without consequences. The one thing it will do is make the church stronger. 70 years of persecution of China has been persecuting the church, and there's somewhere around 300 million Christians in China. How is that even possible? It's because the persecution of the church makes it stronger. Because they have no choice but to rely on God. You can't rely on yourself. It comes under the heading of God will build His church and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Or the laws of China or the laws of Canada won't either. And I read Joshua because of his quote he made at the end of his life. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Choose today what you will do. Let's pray. Lord Jesus,